My point is rather this, that as long as we do not engage in a dialogue with the other, the Quran specifically, and Islam, will remain threatening, mysterious, weird, strange to us. So Samtiden is about the opposite, engaging in a dialogue with the other, trying in forthcoming issues to write about topics like the Quran, which are decisive for our understanding.
Radicalization, as you both mentioned now, has many causes and many factors, and it could be a reaction to
Cruelty.
Cruelty, dominant leaders, secularism. But as today's theme is the Quran, in what way does the Quran play a role in the radicalization, whether it's violent or non-violent? The Salafis, like in Norway, like the foreign fighters who've gone to Syria, about all of them have been through important Salafi movements here before they left. So they would use or abuse the Quran as a rule book, as something very concrete. And this is a question that many people ask themselves, what does this to do with Islam? What does this has to do with the Quran? If actually to all of you, as this is such an important topic for Europe and the rest of the world now, with a radicalization of our youth.
Well, Karen's looking at me, so I'll take this tough question first, and then she'll probably do a better job with it than I do. But first of all, the Quran in and of itself, as itself, doesn't have anything. It doesn't do anything. People are, I think Karen put it very well when she said that when people are radicalized, it usually has to do with an element of fear. And a lot of times for the individual, that fear is that they feel that their particular identity is being threatened in some way, their sense of who they are. And so they cling on to this. And then sometimes it depends on what background they come from. They will find a text that other people say that this is a seminal text to our particular tradition. And then from that, take a few verses here that can then reinforce a particular ideology and a particular political ideology in this particular instance that you're talking about. So it's really not the Quran that is what brings about the process of the radicalization. It's a bunch of external factors, and then people take those verses and they use them. And somebody could just as easily, within a Christian environment or a Jewish environment, go and take Ezekiel 9:5, which is the verse that John was referring to that encourages genocide. You go take Ezekiel 9:5 and then say, well, this is really what the tradition is about, and somebody could be radicalized in that way. And studies have actually shown that when people, for example, go on the Hajj, that they come back with greater empathy. That when people are involved in religious themes, and can you say make the broader sense of the tradition, that it does have a tendency to take people away from violent inclinations and from violent interpretations of the religion. So I think it's very important that we distinguish between what role the actual religious texts are playing and what role the external factors that are causing people to bring these particular interpretations to the texts are bringing.
I just note that the Gallup organization, and I used to be associated with Gallup, they did surveys, particularly with regard to jihad. And what they found was that the people who okayed terrorism were people who cited political grievances, okay, and then would turn to religion. The people who were against, that kind of violent interpretation always cited, would always cite the Quran. Now, if you go back and look at bin Laden's first big interview on CNN, not that he thought it was a big interview, but it's the first big interview. You can get it off the text. What you will see is the first couple of pages are all about political grievances. Grievances with, and they're widespread grievances in the Arab Muslim world. Whether you're talking about Palestine and Israel, whether you're talking about the impact of colonialism. And then after a couple of pages of text. He then, now that he's ready to talk about we need to fight against it, that's when he then draws on Islam and pulls out, and frames what he's going to do, which shouldn't be surprising, in order to legitimate and to mobilize.
And what I got from I think it's your point about the different use of the texts after 9/11 in that Gallup poll. This should have been broadcast throughout the Western world. 93% of Muslims questioned in this massive poll, when asked, were the 9/11 attacks justified, said no and cited the Quran. The 7% only who cited the political reasons. This is a massive finding. And why is it not broadcast sufficiently? Now, about the Quran and modern violence, you must by this time have heard this story about two wannabe jihadis who left Birmingham in the UK a couple of years ago to go to Syria, who'd ordered from Amazon 2 books. One was Islam for Dummies, the other was the Quran for Dummies.
And these were Muslims.
And these were Muslims. There have been studies, forensic psychiatrists who are not liberal softies like me. Some of them, one of them has been a CIA officer, went into Guantanamo and interviewed all the 500 people there who were involved in the 9/11 plot. And he found...
Was that Sageman?
Yes,
Mark Sageman.
His good books, they were readily available. And he found that only 20% of them had had a regular Muslim upbringing. The others were either self-taught, like Islam for Dummies, or they were not observant until they encountered the movement, rather like some of the 9/11 participants, and also the Boston Marathon people, or else they were new converts, like the 2 Nigerian converts who killed a British soldier in the street. He concluded that the problem is not Islam, but rather ignorance of Islam, and closer knowledge of Islam might have deterred them from these crimes. Now, these findings, again, are very important. And at this time, when feelings are running high, and we are seeing the result of with Trump, for example, and Brexit, of the dangers with which we are heading with these inaccurate ideas. And people say, well, why then does IS start off with, in the name of God, Allah, the benign and the merciful? And Tariq Ramadan pointed out, and I think quite rightly, on a panel we were on, this is a bit of defiance. The whole scorn, and maybe it's not so much in Norway, but I have to say in Britain, where religion is held in very low esteem. I mean, I have friends who ask me, please, not to mention my work when I go round to dinner. How can you make a living out of this discredited stuff? The sort of disdain of religion, or the disdain of Islam, it's up, here it is, a thrust of them. But IS itself, the core leadership, seems, as far as we know, to come from Saddam's disbanded army, which would have meant they were secular socialist Ba'athists, not devout Muslims. And IS is the horrible child of the British and American-led Iraq War. So we must remember, this is just their problem out there. And I mentioned this morning that when I started out on all this years ago in the 80s, when I was back listening to those Palestinians talking about the Quran, I went out to work on a film in Israel, Palestine, about St. Paul. But talking with Israelis and Palestinians, and I knew nothing about the conflict there, nothing about Islam, nothing much about Judaism at that point. The one thing they had in common, the Israelis and the Palestinians, was how awful the British had been. And this made me realize that's just not their problem. It's our problem too. We whether we're major players with colonialism in that region, or whether we've just simply backed along, tagging along, just not looking sufficiently into the past of the West and our interference with these countries. Histories are intertwined. And we have to come to terms with our own past, with karma, in a sense, which sows bad seeds and creates bad things. And if you just dump all that on something called Islam, we are missing signs that we desperately need in our dangerously polarized world.
Look at Rabin, who assassinated the prime minister. You had a nice religious boy who was going to religious school, who had a real problem feeling Rabin was selling out Israel, poured over religious text until he could find a text that then legitimated his attempt to assassinate. Now, when that happened, okay, almost nobody thought of brushstroking the religion. Or if you look at Christianity and its history of using, the Crusades, Pope Urban said, God wills it, again, it's this idea of contextualizing and looking at the individual or the individuals. Sageman and I were on the EC Commission on De-Radicalization. They kept changing the title. First it was radicalization, then it was de-radicalization. But one of the things that we found in many of the studies looking at the European situation was that it was an identity issue often driven by one's experience in a society of feeling marginalized, and of no value because of the way the media talked about your religion, because of the way people reacted, in terms of what you saw, the incidents of hate crimes, and also seeing the killing of Muslims overseas, the hundreds of thousands killed or injured in Iraq, and nobody talking talking about that. And it's confirmed by Gallup data, in which a majority of Muslims, when asked, do you hate the West, wind up saying we admire the technology, self-determination, freedoms, education, and we would want that for ourselves. But when asked, well, what don't you like? The denigration of Islam, our religion, and the denigration of Arabs and Muslims, i.e. Arab and Muslim blood is cheaper than other blood. So I think it's that kind of, getting it. It doesn't excuse what people do, but unless we look at that phenomenon, then we'll be naive enough to think that if ISIS disappears, we won't see another terrorist group come up. People thought, with Al-Qaeda, you killed bin Laden, it's all over. The fact is, if the conditions in many of these countries are such, that they can radicalize some, most people, including most youth, accommodate, but others just feel, I've had it and I have to act out. And if, in fact, one sees outside governments propping up the government with money, with arms, etc., then you have this question of the near enemy and the far enemy.
The Islamic State is committing massive breaches of human rights in Syria and Iraq. But they also do it in the name of the Quran. And you mentioned the radicalized youth with identity issues or social issues being recruiting to this movement. Saudi Arabia is also committing massive abuses of human rights on a similar scale, but not so propagandated. Joseph, you have been criticized for having a too liberal interpretation of Islam. You live in the United Emirates. What is the response? What can be the response of, identity issues? Islam being of lesser, Muslims being of, lesser importance in the West and so on. What could be the response with the, holding up the Quran, but with different interpretation to attract young people to see, this is about peace, this is about my community, this is about living here, or what is a more peaceful, moderate way to attract those young people instead of them reading the same passages and interpreting them in the Islamic State or radical way?
Following traditional Islam. Really, this is what it is. If you go back and you look at, history, there's a wonderful book called The Walking Quran. And the Walking Quran, he talks about the tradition in Africa in particular of memorizing the Quran. And you'd have like even the women there would be people who knew everyone had memorized at least 2 full recitations. By the way, there are 10 different schools of recitation for the Quran. And just knowing that the depth that this book had in the classical tradition. One of the things that we tend to miss when we look at the politics, and we discuss this in terms of the politics, is we tend to think of those who denounce the West and this, that, and the other thing. Well, who's actually dying? Who's actually being killed? It's the representatives of traditional Islam. They are the first target. Before the bombing of 9/11, they went and they killed Sheikh Mas'ud, who was the most powerful representative of traditional Islam in Afghanistan. Every single political Islamist group knows that their greatest threat is not the United States, is not Great Britain, is not a whole bunch of people in op-ed sections in Western newspapers writing against them. It is representatives of traditional Islam who have read the text and who interpret the text in ways that adhere to the great intricacies of any long, complex textual tradition. And so going back to that is the way, and it's already there. And what are the things that Muslims actually read? I'll tell you, they read Surah 36, Yasin, Surah 55, the title of which is The Merciful, Surah 56, Al-Waqi'ah, the event, which is about preparing for the Day of Judgment, Surah 67, Al-Mulk, Surah 18, Al-Kahf, the cave, which actually, one of the central stories of it is actually a story of being non-violent in the face of living in a society of disbelievers. These are the things that people actually read. These are the things that Muslims, in a sense, that they kind of live by. Those are also the first parts of the Quran that all Muslims study when they go into the study of the Quran. And when you're studying the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, the very first hadith that you hear, and I've heard hadith scholars say this to me in Yemen, say this to me in Morocco, say this to me in Egypt. This is the very first hadith. Says within it, it says that those who are merciful unto others, God is merciful unto them. Be merciful unto those on earth, and God will be merciful unto you. And scholars emphasize, they say, the reason that you learn this one first is because this is axiomatic. It tells you how to interpret, act upon, and incorporate all of the other hadith within the tradition.
When George W. Bush was president, one almost looks back to those days more positively. But anyway, I didn't say anything. When George W. Bush was president, I got a call from someone in one of the government agencies saying that a number of he and some colleagues, both in his agency and another agency, were interested would I come and talk, and also would I recommend names for other people, but it would be off-site, okay, so like unofficially off-site. And I said, so why are you doing this? And he said, well, we're recent appointees, and we realize that we're making decisions all the time about Muslims in America and the Middle East, and we don't know anything about Islam and Muslims. So the first thing is, and it's gotten better, but policymakers need to know that. The second thing is, without co-opting, who should they be talking to? They should be talking to their citizens who are Muslims, working with those people, those families, those, one of the things that we find is that everybody talks about combating violent extremism now, and yet nobody comes up with a good plan. Well, one of the good plans that some people are talking about is take a look, if you want, for example, in the U.S., in a number of instances where, in fact, there's a real relationship developed with Muslim families and Muslim communities. It's the imams or people in a mosque that come forward and say, we see a problem. Or it's the parents of somebody that come forward and say, we see a problem. And often there's an exclusion of that. Now, think about it right now. When you declare the kind of ban that we're talking about, potentially about, and when you declare on television, Islam hates us, not Muslim extremists hate us, okay? Now, if you're an American Muslim, how many of you are going to think, oh, well, maybe I should reach out to government? Or how many of you, if somebody in the government called you up, in terms of the current government, are going to think, wait a second, So it's creating a climate that then enables you to deal with the issue. The easy, cheap answer, and I saw this in a talk I did on religion and violence at the UN and also at the EU, where in fact the people who were running the program said, as we developed the program, that there was a real debate within their agency, such as the UN. Significant number of people in the UN just say, religion's the problem, because it's an easy answer, rather than the struggle of looking and saying, well, wait a second, religion is a factor, but what are the primary drivers?
This talk that we hear from the top leaders, whether it's Trump or Eastern European leaders, presidents that are totally anti-Muslim. You have experienced Brexit. You have the Trump, the polarization with the Democrats and the press. What kind of room of debate has been opened now? Insults, when that's spoken from leaders, do you feel that is spreading among, getting into the more mainstream and also on the street level when it comes to being Muslim?
Since the Brexit vote, hate crimes in London have increased by 41%. That's a very, very sharp rise.
And in the US.
And it's the politicians, unscrupulous politicians, talking about the other and pure Great Britain, God help us, have given people license to do this. I fear very much we're only at the beginning. Because I think the West, sometimes I think this is the end of Western hegemony. If you look back, as I do, over eons of history, you see very often that when a great empire is coming to an end, certain things crop up. The economy starts getting out of control. Well, certainly we're all in massive debt to China and others. 2, wars are undertaken that can't be won. And 3, you have this kind of yes, what you do is you appoint terrible rulers like Nero and Caligula. And now other certain people have just stepped into that shoes.
Bless you.
And I think that we are at a very, very serious point in history because I have been in this, I was saying this morning, not because I'm filled with peace and love, but because I'm filled with dread at what could happen. The kind of rhetoric that we are hearing now was the kind of rhetoric used by the Nazis in the 1930s that enabled Hitler to do what he did in Germany, one of the most cultivated societies in Europe. And I think it's also a very, very worrying, this whole business of retreat, building walls against the other, with sort of make Britain great again. We cannot live without one another. We are living in a globalized world. We've created a global market which is our economies are so interdependent that when stocks fall in one part of the world, markets plummet all around the globe that day. What happens in the Middle East today could have political repercussions now in Britain tomorrow. And we all face the same environmental catastrophe. We're linked together on the World Wide Web. This retreat into these ethnic it's a terrible form of irrational denial. We're not looking squarely at our situation. And this morning, I finished my talk at the university with a wonderful quotation from the Quran, which the Prophet himself spoke in his last farewell sermon. When he was bidding farewell to the Muslim community. O people, we have created you from a male and a female, and we have formed you into tribes and nations so that you may get to know one another. And this is the task of our time, to get to know one another, not to retreat into these ghettos telling stories about one another, but the hard process, which is a journey of unraveling some of our own preconceptions and chauvinisms, and entering out to realize that whether we like it or not, we are in the same boat. And I very much fear that unless we manage to do this, the world is simply not going to be a viable place.
The Southern Poverty Law Center for several years, and in fact, one of its studies was cited by the FBI when it wound up about a year ago saying what the Southern Poverty Law Center has been saying for several years, that the first threat, that nobody's denying that there's a danger with Muslim extremists, that they're deadly, okay? But the primary threat in the United States are white anti-government groups. Some of them have a kind of Christian patina to them, but white anti-government groups. And Southern Poverty Law Center talks about how, in fact, the number has metastasized when Obama was elected and in the last year with regard to the way our elections are going. The number of anti-Muslim sort of sites has tripled since election time. So what we need to do is put things in a context. One of the problems we have, and again, I want to be really clear about where I stand on terrorists, that okay, there's zero tolerance. But when you have conventional warfare, you're worried, but you're going to have big armies going against big armies, and then you're going to, so you're going to be worried about how large the army is, how large the plane is. When you have a situation that's not conventional warfare, where in fact two people can go in and take out a lot of people, on the one hand, you have to be really concerned because there's an extra sense of vulnerability. You know what I mean? The people can be there. It's not like they're, coming at you with a plane. But you have to put it into proportion, okay? How many people have been killed by that, okay? And get that contextualized, because often when we talk about it, we're talking about a very small group of people. Even with ISIS has gone beyond our imagination in terms of what it's done. It's never had more than 30,000 followers. But how has it made itself, and how have they really terrorized Europe? When Europe recently, the French, etc., started going in, then they started coming in and they attacked Paris and they attacked Brussels. And there's symbolism there. Just as when the attacks in the U.S. took place, it was the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. So to go into Paris because of some of the statements that the president of Paris had made, and the involvement of his Air Force, and to go into Brussels because it's the capital, again, the shock value, the terror value is there, but one doesn't want to blow that out of proportion, because that's exactly what terrorists want. The whole idea of terrorism, any terrorism, by the way, Mark Sageman has a new book out that you'll really like because it's very thin. And if my mother were here, she'd say, but John only reads books that also have pictures in them. But the reality of it is that Mark has something out that kind of gets into the history of terrorism, but it's also in some of his earlier work in which, he basically, says that, in effect, if we don't get it right, and if we overreact, and if we don't deal with what are the real drivers, we're never going to solve the problem. And he actually interviewed Guantanamo. Mark Sageman, by the way, is somebody with a PhD and then also a psychiatrist who was a senior person in the CIA, and then has done major consulting, including even recently with the UK and Guantanamo, interviewed lots of folks there. So you get a pretty good fix from him in terms of, where he's coming down. Anyway.
You spoke from UK perspective, the US perspective. I was just in the Midwest last week, and I spoke to a Muslim girl in hijab in North Dakota, saying now how it was to enter a bus, how she would listen to people saying, not directly to her, but we're gonna cleanse this country now. It's a scary feeling talking to really young Americans. I will end with you, Joseph, you're an American Muslim. End with you, go back to the main theme, the Quran. How can this young girl be supported by the American Muslims community that you are a part of? It's also a very polarized. It's not a one voice community. How can that community be helpful
That's
in
a
this
tough one.
context?
I mean, because the entire community is one that feels very much under threat right now, and so it's very difficult. And history has shown that when you have situations where communities start to feel this type of internal pressure, that you do have different groups within the community turning in upon one another. And then you have people becoming informants for the community, and oftentimes the way in which they're doing that is to actually get vengeance for something that happened 15 years ago. And so the most important thing that the community can do is to not give in to those types of feelings, and to study what has happened with communities in this way in the past. And also, this is where I mentioned the term traditional Islam before. And many people who speak about this within the Jewish context, you'll find many scholars who speak about this, say that there's a fundamental difference between tradition and traditionalism. And that tradition is when you take the texts of the tradition and you try to apply these teachings to the exigencies, the contemporary situation, the exigencies of the moment. Whereas traditionalism is to go back to how people read this text at such and such a time in such and such a way and try to mimic what they once did. And that's never going to work. And that, unfortunately, is the way that many communities sometimes seek to answer these types of situations. But to use tradition, where you're actually trying to live the texts, so trying to, as the tradition says, be that walking, living Quran. There's a famous prayer of the Prophet, which is probably a very good way to end, that you often hear in sermons. It says, Allahumma ij'al al-Qur'an rabi'a qulubina. That is, O God, make the Quran the spring of our hearts. Because it's thought that when you make it the actual spring of your hearts, that then your actions, that will condition everything through which you do. And it should be a process of the purification of the heart. And that through that, people can find answers from within themselves to the difficulties that confront them.
Karen and I came up with part of the solution. I think we were talking about it this morning. And that is that, I think if you look at the response to the ban when it was first announced, in the States, within hours, thousands of people went, okay? And the thousands of people were not all Muslims. Many of them were people who belonged to NGOs, human rights organizations, Black Lives Count. So when the situation gets really bad, and I think even if that were to occur in Europe, it will mobilize a sector of society that might not have been paying attention to a lot of this, but suddenly realize, wait a minute, this goes against the principles and values of my country. And the reason I'm concerned about it is, maybe I'm concerned about them, but it's also, if we change the principles and values, what does that mean for me? What does it mean if I allow this person who's the president or prime minister to do a whole set of things? Not only what would that do now, but with a precedent like that, what does it mean the next time we have an election and somebody suddenly says, well, there's a precedent for what I'm doing?
Thank you. We should have had your books here. We should have had a bookseller selling them. If we had laid them out here on the stage, they would have filled the stage. They can be bought online or through Tronsmo or ordered. These three guys are also on Twitter, so it depends what kind of message you're looking for. But thank you so much for telling us and enlighten us about this topic. And Samtiden, I thought I would also get into the themes of ecology and feminism, but was only time for jihad, sorry. But Samtiden, you should subscribe to it. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.